right, so on to the people that you probably actually wanted to come and see. I want to introduce our first speaker, Kelsey Atherton. He is giving a talk, as you saw, on killer robots. So Kelsey D. Atherton is an award-winning military technology journalist who now works in advocacy for a less explodey world. Very topical right now. So please, let's welcome to the stage Kelsey. Pull that up. So to advance, you just click down.
Down is advance.
Yep, and there, that's to go back.
Okay.
And then there's a laser pointer if you want to use it.
Great. All right, well, imagine that you can see this slide, but killer robots, or the delicate art of teaching machines to kill. I am going to talk to you about my time reporting on and the world of autonomous robots with weapons. Okay. This is the thing about being a technology journalist. I write about them, I didn't use them. All right, how's this? Is it sounding better in the back? You need to hear it a little more? Is that good? No, close enough? Okay, great. So, for about a decade, I wrote about war, robots, and other bad futures. I wrote it at a variety of outlets. Some of them you would have heard of, places like Popular Science, Slate. I got exactly one story in the New York Times, so I'm counting it forever. And other places, which are like trade publications, like Breaking Defense, which you would have no reason to read unless you're looking to sell contracts to Raytheon, and C4ISRNet, which is a publication named after an acronym coined by Raytheon. You need to know that less. So that was my job. Now I am at the Center for International Policy, where I edit the International Policy Journal, focused more on politics by first means rather than politics by other means, which is to say, how do we not explode the world? A shout out to the cartoonist Matt Bors for both of these avatars. I'm super thrilled. So, we're going to be talking about killer robots. You might think this is where I started. Let's obviously define this. This is the last slide I put together. We'll see if this acronym sticks. Here is my rough understanding of what makes it a robot worth thinking of as a killer robot. It's armed. In the dark slide there, that's a Russian stamp of the marker uncrewed ground vehicle, which can carry a weapon. It's what if a tank was tiny and had a machine gun on top and no humans inside. Then there is the face of the Ghost Robotics QUGV, which is a robotic dog with sensors. Below that is the UCAV, which was an experimental uncrewed combat aerial vehicle tested by the Navy. That one has successfully taken off from and landed on aircraft carriers. And the last one, which I can kind of see, is just a uncrewed surface vehicle, just a boat on the water without people. What matters for thinking about these things is, are they armed? Are they carrying a weapon? Are they sensing? Do they perceive the world around them in some way and then make decisions about that? Autonomous, is the robot making the decision without or with limited human input? And then probably mobile gives me the tidy acronym ASAP, but also we're thinking about machines that move primarily but not exclusively. I'll get to that in just a second. So here is an example of a not killer robot and a possibly killer robot. This is the Ghost Robotics QUGV. It's like the big dog Spot that you've probably seen, Boston Dynamics Spot robot. That one is in like beer commercials and stuff. This is the one made more specifically for a military audience. It has sensors, it has legs that work on actuators. They can figure out balance by how it senses resistance with its legs, which is a really sort of fascinating way to make a four-legged robot work. And without a weapon, it's a sensing tool. The Air Force has tested them in patrolling around bases. You could use them for scouting. You could have them deploy with squads for house clearing. If they go in first, they can see what's happening in there, and then you don't put a person in harm's way, is the ostensible purpose. But if you have a moving sensing robot and then you just stick a big old gun on it, as the Gunmakers Sword International did at a trade show in 2021, then suddenly you have a potential killer robot. And so we're going to be talking about why would you build a killer robot? I'm going to be sticking strictly with examples from real life, but obviously there's a rich fiction of what happens when there's a robot built and it decides to kill. There's lots of examples. You are thinking of them yourself. Every single article on killer robots for the past 30 years has started with a reference to Terminator. This is my one Terminator reference. But the reason a military would actually pursue this, despite the risks, both fictional and imagined, is that it's cheaper to have a robot move itself than it is to have people remotely pilot it at a certain scale. The drone warfare that was a big enduring part of the Obama terms and the first Trump term, and just as a recurring part of how a lot of counterinsurgency has been waged as part of the war on terror, there were huge amounts of people involved in flying those drones. There's no pilot on the drone, but every Predator drone and then Reaper drone in flight had a crew of 2 at all times. There's a human piloting it, and there's a human manning the sensors. And then the flights could last up to 24 hours, and so you swap out crews every 8 hours. So that's 6 people just to fly the thing. But also the Air Force would have people operate the landing and takeoff separately from the people controlling it remotely in flight. That's a whole team. You would have terabytes and terabytes of video hours recorded, and if you're having humans analyze that, that's a huge amount of people there. If you remove all those humans involved and then you instead give those tasks to a computer, you say you trust a computer to interpret what the camera sees, a computer to make sure it stays in level flight, it plots a course, it picks up sensor readings, it transmits back what it needs to, then you have a person then you reduce the amount of people needed to control robots. We'll get to this at the very end, but autonomy is potentially labor saving, or it lets you at least do more with the same amount of people rather than assigning lots of people to redundant work. They're also cheaper. The robot picture there is a Valkyrie combat drone, sort of tester. We haven't actually deployed them yet, but there's been a lot of training and development in them. Costs about $3 million. It's designed to be operated by pilots flying airplanes that can cost anywhere from $60 to $90 million. So a lot cheaper if you can put some bombs, some weapons, some extra cameras on a $3 million body. Suddenly you don't have to put another $80 million plane in the sky to get the same kind of coverage, or to expand the coverage you're getting from your F-35s. It's also, there's a strategic consideration, which is it's less of a problem if a drone gets shot down than if a human pilot gets shot down. This is important for commanders who can feel they can more adequately send things out. There's not no risk, but there's less risk if you send a drone out and it gets shot down. It also means that in high-profile incidents where a drone is shot down, the geopolitical consequences are severely less. It's not the same. It's not bloodshed. It's equipment destroyed or lost that has to be replaced. And that's a huge deal. It's a big consideration of why you might want to develop an autonomous system first. And then the other reason that you might want to see these deployed, this is not really a reason I've ever seen stated, but it's certainly brought up as a possible complication, is when you have a human pilot dropping a bomb, there's a clear chain of command. There's the commander who gave the order, there's the pilot who followed it or made a decision contrary to the order. You can trace that all the way up a chain of command. You can find accountability and at least attribution, if not necessarily justice, in courts for accountability if there's an error, if it's something wrong or something horrific happens. If the pilot goes rogue, you know that the pilot went rogue or the commander ordered them to go rogue. With a machine, the ways autonomy can go wrong can be how it was coded, if there was error in the sensors, if there was error between the sensors and the coding, if there was a lack of communication or an error interpretation, if there was an error or something wrong given in how it was said. There's a whole host of ways that you can't quite pin down why a robot went wrong if a robot went wrong. So here are some types of ways machines can be autonomous. This is this is a sort of access to think of these things. This is a rough chart put together. I thought I'd read this somewhere. I had just imagined reading it somewhere. So this is wholly my work. If you are an academic who studies this, please correct me. But there's a spectrum of mobile and immobile. Is the machine moving? This is why autonomous machines are probably, but not always, mobile. And then there's when is the target for the weapon selected? And one of the things that is really important to think about is that robots are making decisions in time different than when a soldier fires a gun or a pilot shoots a missile or a ship fires a torpedo. That time between the launch of a weapon and when the decision of what target to hit is where autonomy can happen. It can change what it's targeting, how it's targeting. So some examples that I have on here. If it's a mobile and it's selected at launch, if you put a bomb on something and then you set it off later, that's placed at launch, and that's a human choosing when. They picked it. You put a car on a tank, you put a car on the tank, you put a bomb on the tank and you blow it up. Suddenly, you've made a human decision here. If you fire a missile, the missile goes towards its target unless, and there's obviously an exception, not obviously, there's an exception to this, which is missiles that can choose targets in case the first target they hit has been destroyed, which is the long-range anti-ship missile. It's in development by Lockheed for a long time. Can choose targets after, but generally, when you launch a missile, it goes towards what you aimed it at the time you hit launch. But there's a couple categories that are pretty distinct in this, and I'm going to mention landmines first because they predate what we think of as killer robots, but they have a lot of the same kind of risk. So a landmine is an explosive placed in the ground that is set off by some kind of trigger. It's in a way like sensing an environment. One of the more common ones is pressure. If it detects a certain amount of weight on top of it, that pushes down on the fuse and it sets it off. That's sensing and then activating. And a landmine will always have that sensing until it breaks or is disarmed. But if you place it, you could be placing it in the middle of a war to try and hold a static front line. And then the war ends. Everyone goes home. You sign your treaties. You have your big parades. But the mine is still there. And unless you go out and clean it, the mine is still sensing. The mine is still waiting for a person. So that's autonomous in time, independent in time. It can last out there. And it can make a decision, and that's a really specifically of concern for humanitarian reasons because it can end up hitting people long after the war is over, and then it's not targeting combatants, but it's targeting anyone in the area. This is a big problem in Cambodia specifically had a long history of this. There are several other places where left explosives on battlefields are a humanitarian crisis and discovered often tragically. The other category, which is a weapon you may not have heard of, this is fun drinking conversation. These weapons you have not heard of, these mangled bodies. The other one you may not have heard of is a loitering munition, which is a fancy word for a drone that is sometimes a missile. We'll get into one of those in the specifics in a second, but basically, this is a flying machine with an explosive on board that looks for something to blow up, and when it finds it, it then becomes a missile. It acts like a missile, and it turns into a weapon and destroys it. But if it never finds it, it can disarm its warhead and land and fly another day. So this is talking about the time between launch and detonation. We're often talking about explosives here. You could conceivably have this with a computer system and another weapon. But so a loitering munition can take a long time to find things, hours. A homing missile, like a heat seeker you might see on an anti-air missile fired by a fighter jet at another fighter jet, that'll take minutes. And an immobile weapon, like a landmine or a naval mine, will be live until it's detonated or disarmed. And that can last for a very, very long time. This isn't quite a landmine, but it's a story worth telling. There was a man in 2008 in Virginia with the curious hobby of refurbishing Civil War cannonballs. This was not a particularly safe hobby, and he met the end you would expect for a guy whose hobby was unearthing cannonballs and working on them in his garage. But that cannonball was a Civil War cannonball. It was fired at some point in the 1860s. It stayed a live explosive throughout the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, until this guy unearthed it in 2008, brought it to his garage, and started working on it. So when I say that you can have a long time span for an explosive like this, I mean a long time span. That's a weapon fired in 1 century that kills 2 centuries later. Here is a poster put out by Army Futures Command about the next generation combat vehicle. The Army is very eager to figure out how we can have robots on the battlefield. What can they do? One of the things you can do to make a really simple Army robot is you can take an existing gun turret. This is the CROWS, the remotely operated weapon system. And it carries a gun and a bunch of sensors. There's an infrared and an electro-optical, which just means visual light, camera on the sensor, and you put it on a robot platform. That's not necessarily a killer robot. That's usually communicating with the human. But depending on where you put autonomy in that system, you are possibly making it a killer robot. This is just a fascinating image. I once had a piece that never got picked up about everything going on here, but it's like a World War I style trench scene with a robot in the middle of it. The emphasis that the robot doesn't bleed, that's a reason to use it. It's important for, I think, to understand how militaries think about themselves, think about the work they're doing. We're going to go back to those trenches. One of the predecessors to all drones and all cruise missiles is a weird little biplane called the Kettering Aerial Torpedo. It was built for World War I. It was never used. The war ended before it could be deployed, but it was tested extensively. And here, it worked because it had a timer. You would fire it, it would launch on rails, it would ascend, go in a straight line, and at a certain point, the timer would run out, it would turn the engine off, it would release its wings, and it would plummet to the ground as a bomb. In World War I, positions were pretty fixed. It's the iconic example of a static front. You had your trenches, you could assume where the enemy was. It's very easy to target that way. You just go over the line, and you don't have to risk a pilot doing it if you're flying a torpedo. We didn't have the term for UFO back in 1918, but in testing, one Kettering bug was tested in Ohio, and it went wildly off course. It was flying weird. They had to go trace it down, but they didn't have a way to say, hey, farmer in rural Ohio, we happened to lose our experimental flying torpedo. Did you see it? So they asked about a lost plane. And the people they asked, the farmers, the people in the country, reported seeing a drunk pilot who then parachuted out. There was no parachute. There was no person on board this. They imagined that part of it. But it was easier to make up the story in their mind that they had seen a pilot bail out of this aerial torpedo than accept the reality, which is they'd seen an experimental weapon that was off course and just had no pilot. The Army did not correct them on this. When asked, they said, oh, he's recovering in a hospital. He's fine. We have the pilot. Have you seen the plane? This predates the UFO scare, but I think it's kind of a big touchstone for it. This is what happens when you don't have the language to talk about UFOs. You just imagine seeing pilots on your weird aircraft. Here is the obligatory shot of Marilyn Monroe. She was discovered by an Army photographer while assembling drones for World War II. These drones were targets. One of the reasons it was you would have a very simple use. Drone as a category descends from these World War II target drones. You have them radio controlled. You don't have to put people on them. You can train pilots how to shoot down planes. There she is building one. And then the sort of whole history of uncrewed aviation comes from that drone experience. Here is the loitering munition that I had alluded to earlier. There's a few countries that use them. Perhaps the most successful example was Azerbaijan in October 2020 in its war and its invasion of Armenia. But this one was built by Israel. It was also, there's a predecessor one that was used in the 80s in wars Israel fought with Syria. It is a flying sensing machine that carries an explosive payload and can turn into a missile. What it specifically senses for is the signature of a radar, an anti-aircraft radar. The military explanation to build this machine that can seek out and crash into and blow up radar stations is if you send the robots out first, then you can have your crewed aircraft, your human-piloted planes, fly afterwards without worrying about getting shut down. This is one in active use. It's probably the closest thing to a killer robot that has seen real war today. Here's the Valkyrie, which we saw in the background of an earlier slide. This is it's being tested by the Marines and the Air Force. The Marines, unfortunately, had the better pictures. Apologies to the Air Force. But it's significantly more capable than many things. It can keep up with and fly the range and distance that you would see with a crewed fighter. And it's designed to expand how many aircraft we have in the sky, to carry extra sensors, to carry extra weapons, to really fill out the kind of flight attack wing we might have if we were going to go to war. This is one developed by the US. There's other loyal wingmate programs in development elsewhere. But the US military publishes photos to public domain, which makes it one of the easiest things to talk about and make slides of. On July 3rd, the Air Force announced that it had successfully done some manned-unmanned teaming, which is the term for when a human pilot controls a robot in the air. Specifically, 2 fighter pilots, one in an F-16 Fighting Falcon, one in an F-15 Strike Eagle, each pilot had controlled 2 drones. So rather than just having the 2 pilots in the air in their planes, you suddenly have 6 aircraft. And it's autonomy that makes it possible. It's the autonomy of the machine that makes it possible. It's still communicating with people. And so one of the real big questions is where in this process is the autonomy coming down? What is being made autonomous? What is being sensed? What of the information being sensed is being relayed to the humans in control? The term for this is human in the loop or human on the loop. Is a human involved in the decision-making process of a machine? And is a human involved in a way where a human has to actively approve certain decisions by the machine? Or that's human in the loop, where the machine cannot make an attack, make a lethal decision without getting a human approval. Human on the loop is that the machine is telling a human what they can do, and the human can say stop if they want to, but they don't have to. That's sort of a human observing the robot and saying, you do your thing. So here are some possible controllers. There's an infantry helmet that was originally developed by Microsoft and then adapted by the Army as the sort of a heads-up display like you might see in a video game, giving you kinds of extra information with extra cameras all loaded in. Looks real sci-fi. There's a picture, I forget what targeting reticle that is. Some targeting reticle at an ARM show in 2015. And then the other one is a lot of these controllers are modeled on and built around gaming controllers. A story I say it never did, maybe someday I'll do it, was about the various successors and ancestors of the original Xbox controller that have been adapted into ways to control robots. This one has a tablet in the middle, so maybe this is more like your Steam Deck adaptation for war. But gaming controllers are a pretty intuitive way. They're a language that's pretty familiar to anyone entering the military at this point. And it can present information in a way very familiar and then make it responsive. One of the reasons for the Xbox controller, since I have this tangent and I can't let it go, is because that was a USB and it was very easy to develop in research. And then you could go on and you could build out your own proprietary controller if you wanted to sell it at a super markup. But you could develop it on an Xbox controller and just replace it, and it's very easy to do plug-and-play controls in a familiar setting. So this is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my time reporting. This was part of a presentation on what was billed as a combatant identification tool. I want you to study this image for a second. We're getting enough shade here, you should be able to see it. There's a few objects marked, and they're identified in a couple of ways. Again, this was a, normally there's a big October Army arms show in DC, but in 2020, it went virtual, and this was a virtual presentation at the AUSA show. And I'm gonna pull up the quote I heard while this was being described. I want you to study this for a second. We see, well, here it is. The person making the sale for the sensor system said that it would unburden the operator's workload through autonomous target selection using an onboard neural network. As it was relayed, and I didn't quite put this in the text, but I have in the transcript somewhere, it could distinguish between an insurgent and a civilian and a uniformed combatant, a soldier. But we see that it's identifying a person in a parking lot and a tree as though they're the same thing. So when we're talking about error, there's a whole range of places it can happen, but one of the biggest ones is sensors. Is the sensor perceiving what it's supposed to be perceiving? Is it communicating that clearly? Do the people using it know that it thinks a tree looks like a person or a person looks like a tree? If you accidentally think trees look like people, you'll be firing in a lot of wrong places. If you think people look like trees, you're missing what you're supposed to be seeing. There's a whole mess of ways this can go wrong. There's a whole world of ways to fool and distract machine vision. People have studied when you come to like self-driving features in certain models of semi-autonomous cars, that if you modify street signs in a way that would not fool a human, they will see 3s as 8s, which is a horrific thing in like a 30-mile-an-hour zone. There's all kinds of ways you can fool a machine, and that really matters when we're thinking about autonomy. How does the machine get it wrong? Is it perceiving wrong? Is it interpreting wrong? Is there a way for the human listening to the output from the machine to figure out what is going wrong? There's so much more to get into. I'm happy to open up the floor to questions if we have time for that. But if you are interested in reading some of this, I put up a QR code with some links to what I've written on this in a few places. I'm happy also to, well, thank you all for listening to my very, very light and cheery conversation on a light and cheery topic. All right, so the question is about the use of first-person view drones by Ukraine with hard fiber optics for coding. There is so much in this. So the Ukraine war has seen an explosion of development in this entire field. One reason you would get hard fiber optic cords for it is that there's so much signal interference. A lot of what we're talking about, where humans are checking in, where humans are controlling these machines, is over radio. And once you have a critical density of radio, or you know that your enemy is using radio, it makes sense to jam radio. But you can do wire control. Wire control dates back decades. There's wire control robots that were used with explosives in World War II. You just have it wire out, and it's still sending the signal back. And as long as you have enough wire and it doesn't get tangled, you can do it. So drones using fiber optics is a development on top of that, is a sort of improvisation on top of that. You can build some autonomy into this. Autonomy is another way to get through this. But if you're really invested in having direct human control, or you don't trust your software enough, a hard-coded way, a hard-corded way in this case, is how you would get some maintain human control over the weapon. Sure. Sure. So I think there's. So in case you didn't hear it, but that was very clear, is what is my broad take on the rollout of autonomy for warfare and autonomous weapons? And there is, and we've seen, I didn't mention it here, I was trying to sort of give an overview of the machines, but there is a whole debate over whether or not autonomy is life-saving. Is it better to put machines into harm's way instead of people into harm's way? And machines can operate faster than people. Why would we want necessarily to put humans up against that? And I have two broad takeaways. One is that the nature of warfare, which concerns humans and will always see humans in battlefields as either participants or possibly just inadvertent bystanders or the targets, we have to be really careful about what we're trusting beyond that. We do trust weapons every day to 19-year-olds in the military and military services. We also trust it through a chain of command and accountability. And there's whole processes and laws and long-established treaties. There are ways to regulate this. We know 19-year-olds will mess up and can mess up. What is most striking to me about autonomy, what I find most fascinating and most concerning about it, is we don't know the ways in which machines can go wrong. We know some of the ways. We know it can mistake things. We know it can fail in ways that humans can. We don't know the ways it can fail that humans can't. There's all sorts of room for potential errors, for imagining new threats, for interpreting things differently, for acting independently, for just emergent behavior we've seen. And this is a challenge of autonomy, to make a machine that functions without constant direct human guidance. You have to give it the capability to sense its environment, learn, and move through it, and still understand and meet some human objective. But there's a ton of room for error. There are ongoing and have been ongoing for a long time negotiations at Geneva to have a convention on autonomous weapons. Broadly, the way it breaks down is that there's countries without any capability or interest in developing them who are really interested in very strong restrictions. And there's a handful of countries like the US, Russia, and China who are actively developing them, who are not particularly strongly in favor of limiting their own forces' abilities with these rules. I'm super skeptical that these can be deployed without introducing new and terrible harms. That said, I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. All right, so the question was, to what extent are drones being used against other drones? And they're sort of happening in parallel. One of the main challenges, and this comes up with the Ukraine example, which is a whole other, we could go into whole depth about the way that like off-the-shelf drones are being used in Ukraine, are being modified, and inspiration for military dedicated drones. But a lot of the kind of drones you might like pick up at a Costco, or you might have, your buddy might have to like do like real estate photography, that's broadly the basis for the kind of drones you see in mass numbers used in war. And one of the defining characteristics is they can fly for about 20 minutes. Battery weight is the huge constraint. Batteries are heavy. If they're electric, you want them to be electric, especially at war, because that's quieter, that's cheaper. You can recharge them. And you can recharge and have lots and lots of like 20, 30-minute flights, but you can't do a lot more than that. And so to have sort of the kind of imagined drone duels, you would have to have an interceptor drone in that short flight window ready to act. That said, people have tested it. We've seen things where one of the techniques you could use is you could have a drone carrying just like a net and fly at another drone, because a small drone does not have the room for options. Its propellers are almost certainly plastic or not much stronger. And if you put like a fishing net on that, the drone doesn't work anymore. There's also jamming is a big countermeasure. There's a whole host of other countermeasures. The kind of worst one we've seen, which we've actually seen used, is using something like a missile dedicated for anti-aircraft to take out a smaller drone. But that's what you have, that's what you use. And there's a whole world of trying to develop better answers to something that doesn't fly for very long, it doesn't fly for very far, but boy, do you not want it flying with an explosive at you. My favorite fictional killer robot. You would think I would have a ready-made answer. Bender's pretty good. I don't know what his body count actually is. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of the droids from the Clone Wars show specifically, but there's some goofy things you can do with machines that are slowly developing an awareness that they're made to kill and they're not very good at it. All right. I think that does it. Feel free to talk to me about this later, and enjoy reading. Thank you all for being such a lovely audience.
Thanks again, Kelsey. I, for one, welcome our robot overlords.